Her sister kicked her and the kids out to the garage for Thanksgiving. But an hour later, a black limousine pulled into the driveway, and the driver called her by name. What happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel, and in the comments, tell me what city you're from. The sound of rain against the kitchen window was the only thing breaking the silence. Aaliyah stood at the sink, her hands submerged in cold water, scrubbing the last dinner plate with the same focus she gave to everything lately, as if doing it just right might somehow change the reality pressing down on her shoulders. The old faucet dripped in an irregular rhythm, and the dull overhead light flickered every few minutes, reminding her she hadn't yet replaced the bulb. That would have to wait. Everything waited now. Behind her, 12-year-old Corey sat hunched at the rickety kitchen table, quietly folding his younger sister's school uniform. 9-year-old Lynn was on the worn-out sofa in the adjoining room, reading a battered copy of Charlotte's Web she had borrowed for the third time from their local library. It was the only book she ever wanted to reread, maybe because she saw herself in the small, unnoticed characters who clung to kindness like it was a life preserver. Their apartment was modest at best. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, peel-and wallpaper in the hallway, and a heater that groaned like an old man every time it kicked in. But it was clean. Immaculate, in fact. Aaliyah made sure of that. If they couldn't have comfort, at least they'd have dignity. After the divorce, everything in Aaliyah's world had shifted like loose gravel beneath her feet. Her ex-husband, Darien, had left her for a younger woman, a woman with no children, no stretch marks, and a future he hadn't already helped unravel. He'd moved out 3 weeks before last Thanksgiving, telling her coldly that he needed to start fresh, like she was something rotten he had to scrape off his shoe. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal. It was the silence that followed. He didn't call, didn't check on the kids, didn't pay child support. And when she tried to chase him down through the courts, she found out he'd already quit his job, disappeared, like a ghost she used to kiss goodnight. To survive, Aaliyah took on 2 jobs. By day, she cleaned offices downtown, her back aching from hours of bending and scrubbing. By night, she delivered takeout for a food app company, her old sedan wheezing from block to block as she tried to hit enough deliveries to make rent. Most nights, she got home after 10, her shoes soaked, her bones sore, and her mind clouded with guilt over how little of her was left for Corey and Lynn. Still, they didn't complain. Corey, tall for his age, quiet and watchful, had inherited his father's deep-set eyes, but none of his coldness. He had become the man of the house overnight, doing his homework between loads of laundry, making toast for Lynn in the mornings when Aaliyah left before sunrise. And Lynn, sweet and sensitive, still left little notes in her mother's lunchbox. "You can do it, Mommy," written in rainbow crayon with hearts drawn in the corners. Aaliyah dried the plate and set it on the rack. She turned off the faucet, letting the drip become a distant echo. She looked at the clock. Nearly 8. Tomorrow was Thanksgiving. "Mom?" Lynn's voice floated in gently. "Are we doing anything for tomorrow?" Aaliyah's heart clenched. The question wasn't innocent. It was hopeful, but not expecting. Lynn had learned early not to expect too much, especially since last year when they'd spent the holiday with peanut butter sandwiches and a streaming movie because they couldn't afford a turkey. "I was thinking," Corey spoke without lifting his head, "maybe we could visit Aunt Belinda." The name hung in the air like a dropped glass. Aaliyah dried her hands slowly and turned around, unsure of what to say. Belinda. It had been almost 2 years since she had seen her half-sister. Technically, they shared a father, but Their lives couldn't have been more different. Belinda was born from their father's first marriage, a polished, golden girl with porcelain skin and honey-colored eyes who had always been treated like the crown jewel of the family. When their father remarried Aaliyah's mother, a dark-skinned woman from Georgia with a deep voice and a laugh like music, everything changed. Aaliyah was born into that shift. From the start, Belinda kept her distance, polite but cold, like an acquaintance forced into proximity. Even when they were little, Belinda refused to share toys or invite Aaliyah into her room. At family gatherings, she'd correct her grammar in front of guests and introduce her simply as my dad's other daughter. Their mother, Yvonne, had tried to bridge the gap. She made meals for both girls, helped with school projects, even braided Belinda's hair when her own mother dropped her off early. But Belinda remained distant, dismissive, and as they grew older, the gap widened. When their father died, everything fell apart. Belinda took over the estate, sold the family home, and offered Aaliyah nothing but a final, curt message. You've always wanted to make it on your own. Now's your chance. Now, Belinda lived in an enormous house in a gated community just outside the city, with a handsome white-collar husband, 3 children in private schools, and Instagram-worthy parties that looked like magazine shoots. Aaliyah had only seen glimpses through social media, posts that made her feel like a stranger looking into a museum. Still, the kids remembered the house. Once, years ago, before the divorce, Aaliyah had brought them there for a birthday party. They had been stunned by the high ceilings and chandeliers, the clean smells, the velvet chairs. Belinda had smiled stiffly and assigned them a corner of the table. They had barely been acknowledged, but to the children it was a palace. I don't think it's a good idea, Aaliyah finally said, her voice soft but firm. She might say yes, Lynn whispered. Aaliyah looked at them, at the longing in their eyes, at the way they were trying not to beg, and her resolve wavered. Maybe it was foolish, but something inside her whispered, try. Not for herself, but for them. What would it cost to send a message? Maybe an hour's discomfort. Maybe another bruise on her pride. But maybe also a warm room, a good meal, and a moment when her children could feel like they belonged. Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed, she sat on the edge of her worn mattress and stared at her phone for a long time. The contact was still there. Belinda M. She tapped the screen. Hi, I hope you're well. I was wondering if we might stop by for Thanksgiving. Just me and the kids. No expectations. Just thought I'd ask. She stared at the message for a long time, fingers hovering. Then she hit send. No response came that night or the next morning. But as she was packing sandwiches into school lunch bags, her phone buzzed. Sure, dinner's at 5. B, no smiley face. No, looking forward to seeing you. Just 5 words. But they were enough. Aaliyah texted back a simple thank you and didn't mention it to the kids until later. The rest of the day passed in a blur. She finished her morning shift, came home to nap for 30 minutes, then got up and began cleaning the children's shoes, ironing a second-hand dress she'd saved for some special day, and baking a cornbread pie with a few borrowed ingredients from the neighbor across the hall. Corey offered to sweep the car. Lynn brushed her doll's hair and said, "This time, maybe Grandma will remember my name." Aaliyah paused at that. Their grandmother, Belinda's mother, had always been cold toward Aaliyah, and even colder toward her children, never missing an opportunity to point out their otherness. But Lynn's voice was full of hope, and Aaliyah didn't want to tarnish it with her own bitterness. So she smiled and said, "Maybe she will." When they finally packed into the car and pulled out of the narrow alleyway behind their apartment building, Aaliyah tried to swallow the nerves clawing up her throat. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel. This wasn't about her. It was about giving her children one night that didn't feel like survival. The closer they got to Belinda's neighborhood, the more the landscape changed. Shabby storefronts gave way to manicured lawns, cracked sidewalks became brick paths, and the houses grew larger, more distant, more polished. When they reached the security gate, Aaliyah gave her name. The guard checked a clipboard and then waved them through. As they drove up the curved driveway of Belinda's house, the kids pressed their faces to the window, wide-eyed. The house stood like a photograph. Columns, lanterns, perfect hedges. "Are you ready?" Aaliyah asked, forcing a smile. They nodded. She rang the bell. No one came. She rang again. Still nothing. Then, slowly, the door opened. And there stood Belinda, in a burgundy velvet dress and heels too high for comfort, a wineglass in her hand, and a look of poised politeness on her face that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh," she said, "you made it." Aaliyah took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Yes, thanks for having us." Belinda stepped aside. "Come in." And just like that, Aaliyah walked into a world that was never built to hold her, hoping, just for a moment, that maybe this time it might. The warmth inside Belinda's house was immediate but impersonal, like the artificial heat of a department store. The scent of roasted vegetables, citrus candles, and polish hung in the air, clean and curated. Aaliyah stepped over the threshold, gently guiding Lynn and Corey ahead of her. The floor beneath their feet was slick with wax, and the entryway shimmered under a chandelier of dripping glass crystals that looked like frozen tears. Everything around them was gleaming, symmetrical, expensive, and cold. Belinda motioned loosely toward the hallway. "Shoes off, please," she said with a short smile, her tone more fitting for a service worker than a sibling. Aaliyah nodded and reached down to help Lynn out of her boots. Her daughter's socks, though clean, had a tiny hole at the heel. She tugged the pant leg lower to cover it and rose without comment. Belinda was already walking ahead, her heels clacking against the tile like punctuation marks. A sound echoed through the open floor plan, where the living room and kitchen flowed together like a showroom. Voices floated in from the backyard, laughter, clinking glasses, the high-pitched squeal of children playing games. Aaliyah glanced around and took in the details that hurt more than they should have. Pristine, white furniture no one seemed to sit on, an abstract painting the size of a small car, a stack of glossy magazines with Belinda's family smiling from one of the covers. She had done a profile for a local lifestyle feature, balancing motherhood and ambition, the women of Westmore Hills. Aaliyah remembered seeing the article on Facebook and scrolling past it with a tight jaw. "This way," Belinda said as she glided into the kitchen. It was spotless and vast, with a center island larger than Aaliyah's entire dining area at home. Marble countertops gleamed, and a double oven hummed quietly. Nanny-hired children in matching sweaters moved like shadows in the background, too absorbed in their own world to notice newcomers. "Hi," Aaliyah said quietly to one of the kids, a boy about Corey's age, pale and freckled. He looked at her and then at Corey, then turned away without a word. The air inside felt thinner, tighter. Lynn clutched the cornbread pie in both hands like it was a gift of great importance, and maybe it was. She looked up at her mother with searching eyes. "Can we give it now?" she whispered. Aaliyah nodded. "Go ahead." Lynn walked carefully to the counter where Belinda was inspecting a tray of hors d'oeuvres. The girl held out the pie with both hands. "I helped make this," she said. It's cornbread with a little maple." Belinda looked at the dish, then at Lynn. "Oh," she said slowly, "how quaint." There was a pause long enough to register. Lynn's smile faltered. Belinda took the pie and placed it on the far edge of the countertop, away from the platters of gourmet tarts and stuffed mushrooms. Lynn turned back, her eyes lowered, her small shoulders sinking slightly as she walked back to her mother. Elia didn't say anything. She just put a hand on Lynn's head and let it rest there a moment longer than usual. Belinda's husband, Brad, entered then, holding a crystal glass filled with something amber and likely aged. He was wearing a cable-knit sweater draped loosely over his shoulders like a costume of relaxed wealth. "Well, well, Cal," he said, using the nickname Elia hated. "Look at you. It's been a while. The kids look big." He didn't wait for a response, just kept walking through, heading for the back patio. Elia exhaled slowly. She had expected indifference, but the consistency of it still stung. Elia glanced at her phone. It was nearly 5. Around her, the rhythm of the evening moved on without her. Guests arrived, were greeted with hugs and wine, laughter erupted in familiar waves, and no one acknowledged the 3 quiet newcomers standing in the kitchen corner like misplaced furniture. There were no seats offered, no coats taken, no drinks poured in welcome. There was no mention of them at all. Corey stood still, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room like he was trying to find a safe space. Lynn leaned into Elia's side, watching everyone and trying not to seem like she was watching. Belinda returned with a stack of paper plates and plastic cutlery. She set them down near Elia, and with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, said in a bright, performative voice, "We're a little short on space, but don't worry. I set something up for you guys in the garage." Elia blinked, thinking she had misheard. "The garage?" she asked softly. Belinda nodded, the smile sharpening into something more rigid. "Yes. I thought you might be more comfortable there. You're used to scraps, right?" The words landed like a slap. Every conversation in the room seemed to pause, suspended in the vacuum that followed. Elia could feel the air change, hear the clinking glasses stop, sense the way heads turned just slightly and then turned back, pretending they hadn't heard. She didn't react. She didn't flinch. She just reached for the plates. "Come on," she said to her children. The 3 of them walked silently through the house, past the hallway lined with family portraits they weren't in, past the laughter behind the patio doors, past the place where they might have belonged in a kinder version of this story. Belinda didn't follow. She didn't explain. She didn't care. The garage was cold, both in temperature and in tension. The concrete floor was hard and unforgiving with oil stains and dust patches. A single folding table had been set up against the back wall, flanked by 2 metal chairs and an overturned crate. On the table sat a roll of paper towels and a small pile of mismatched plastic utensils. No tablecloth, no decorations, just the bare minimum to fulfill a technical obligation. Lynn looked up at her mother, her eyes uncertain. "Is this where we're eating?" Elia nodded once. Lynn didn't say anything else. She climbed onto the crate and began smoothing her dress underneath her. Corey pulled out a chair for his mother, then sat in the other and stared at the tabletop. Elia unpacked the food Belinda had provided. Turkey slices barely warm, mashed potatoes without gravy, green beans that looked as though they had been steamed hours ago and then forgotten. No cranberry sauce, no bread, no drinks. The 3 of them ate slowly, without conversation. The only sounds were the scraping of plastic against paper and the muffled laughter from the party behind the wall. Corey finally looked up. His voice was quiet but steady. "Why did they put us out here?" Aaliyah paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. "I don't know," she said. Lynn picked at her green beans. "Did we do something bad?" "No, baby," Aaliyah said. "You didn't do anything wrong." "But they're all inside," Lynn said, "and we're out here. It doesn't feel like family." Aaliyah closed her eyes for a second. She felt the ache rise in her chest, that heavy, thick kind of sorrow that came from years of being polite to people who didn't want her there. Her throat tightened, but she didn't cry. She wouldn't give Belinda that victory. She opened her eyes and looked at her children. She smiled, even if it cracked at the corners. "We're together. That's what matters." Corey nodded slowly. Lynn reached across the table and took her mother's hand. In that moment, something inside Aaliyah shifted, not into anger, not into grief, but into clarity. It wasn't about the garage. It was about everything the garage represented. It was about the message they'd been sent. You're not part of us. You never were. But what Belinda didn't know, what no one inside that house understood, was that sometimes the most beautiful transformations happen in the coldest corners. Outside, the sky had begun to darken. The garage door rattled slightly with the wind. The air smelled like rubber and dust, but the warmth around their little table came from something no polished chandelier could ever imitate. Aaliyah didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if she would confront Belinda or leave quietly, or whether she'd ever see this place again. But she knew one thing, and it burned in her chest like a coal refusing to go out. They might have shoved her into a garage, but they had no idea who they had locked in there. The wind had picked up by the time Aaliyah settled into the metal chair, and the garage seemed to breathe with it, drafts curling in from beneath the warped side door, sliding across the concrete floor like invisible snakes. She folded her coat tighter around her waist and glanced at the children, who were still trying to make the best of what was clearly intended as punishment disguised as hospitality. Corey sat with a stubborn straightness as if posture could be armor. Lynn, ever delicate, nudged a bite of mashed potatoes across her paper plate with the edge of her fork, trying to pretend she was still hungry. Outside, laughter burst through the garage wall every few minutes, the telltale crescendo of clinking glasses and polished conversation filtering in as though piped through speakers. It was surreal, hearing so much joy on the other side of a single layer of drywall, while the cold of oil-stained cement seeped through her shoes and into her bones. The folding table in front of them was bare, save for the disposable cutlery and napkins, one of which had already fluttered to the floor. Aaliyah leaned down to pick it up and caught sight of a dusty booster seat discarded in the corner, wedged between a stack of Christmas boxes and an old treadmill. She blinked, unsure why that image hurt so deeply, then sat back up slowly. No one had come to check on them. Not Belinda, not Brad, not even one of the perfectly dressed children who roamed the house like decorative accents. Aaliyah imagined Belinda walking through her immaculate living room with her wine glass poised just so, smiling for her guests as if she hadn't just shoved her sister and her niece and nephew into a garage like leftover furniture. She looked at her children again. Lynn had given up pretending to eat and was now tracing shapes in the condensation of her paper cup. Corey hadn't touched the green beans. His jaw was set tight, the same way it used to be when he came home from school and didn't want to talk about what the boys had called him in the locker room. It was a look that said, "I'm not going to cry. I'm too old to cry." Aaliyah knew that look too well. She had worn it herself more times than she could count. Her chest tightened with a sickening kind of clarity. This insult, this humiliation, wasn't new. It was just the most explicit version of what had always been there. Belinda had never really seen her as a sister, not when they were little, not when their father died, and certainly not now. For years, Aaliyah had tried to rationalize it, to believe it wasn't about race, about bloodlines, about shame. She had told herself it was just a personality difference, a misunderstanding. But tonight stripped away every layer of polite pretense. Belinda had put her and her children in the garage, on Thanksgiving, with paper plates and leftover scraps and a booster seat as a chair. And yet, what made Aaliyah's stomach twist even more was the slow realization that she had seen it coming, and come anyway. She had hoped, against all evidence, that this year would be different. That time and motherhood and struggle had softened Belinda's edges. That the absence of their father might have reminded her how fleeting and precious family truly was. But she had been wrong. So wrong. Lynn finally looked up. "Is it okay if I don't finish?" "Of course," Aaliyah said gently. She took the plate and set it aside. "You've had enough." Lynn nodded and scooted closer, resting her head on Aaliyah's arm. The gesture was automatic, trusting. It reminded Aaliyah why she had come. Not for herself, never for herself. She had come because children remember. They remember the warmth of a room, the taste of a meal, the feeling of being wanted. And she had been so desperate to give them one night where they could sit at a table and feel like they belonged. Instead, they had been exiled to the cold. Corey leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. "I don't get it," he said. "She said she wanted us here. Why would she say that if she didn't mean it?" Aaliyah sighed. "Sometimes people say what makes them look good, not what's real." "But that's lying," Lynn whispered. Aaliyah didn't respond. What was there to say? Yes, it was lying. It was cruelty with a smile. It was weaponized civility. For a long time, none of them spoke. They just sat there. 3 quiet figures framed by cardboard boxes and silence. Aaliyah found herself staring at the smudge of oil on the floor near her feet, a dark stain that looked like an old wound. That's what this was. An old wound reopened. Her mind wandered to the last real conversation she'd had with Belinda. It had been at their father's funeral. Belinda had delivered a carefully rehearsed eulogy, full of platitudes and polished grief. Afterward, Aaliyah had approached her near the reception, hoping for a sliver of shared mourning. Belinda had looked at her, expression blank, and said, "You always needed him more than I did." Then she had walked away. Aaliyah had never truly recovered from that, not because it was cruel, though it was, but because it was true in a way. She had needed him, not just as a father, but as a shield, as proof that she was legitimate, that she mattered. And when he died, it felt like her claim to this family died with him. "Can we just go home?" Corey's voice cut into her thoughts. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even sad. It was flat, numb, and that was worse. "We will," she said. "Soon." They sat for a while longer, and then Lynn, softly, "I'll miss our house, even if it's little." Corey nodded. "It's not little. It's just enough." Aaliyah closed her eyes for a moment, breathing that in. Just enough. Not perfect, not polished, but honest, warm, the kind of place where no one got assigned to a garage. When she opened her eyes again, she felt something inside her settle. Not calm, exactly, but resolve. She reached over and began gathering the plates, stacking them with a quiet purpose. She didn't rush. She didn't cry. There was no drama in her movements, just the finality of someone done begging. She placed the food containers into a paper bag and stood up. Corey followed, then Lynn. They didn't ask questions. They didn't protest. The air was too heavy for that. Aaliyah glanced once more at the closed interior door that led back into the house. She could hear the distant echo of Belinda's laugh, sharp and elegant, like a knife in velvet. Her mother's voice followed, soft and wine-laced, talking about how perfect the stuffing had turned out this year. No one mentioned them. Not once. She turned away and began moving toward the garage door, the one that opened onto the driveway. Her hand reached for the handle, and then she paused. A flicker of light cut across the side wall. Headlights. She turned her head just in time to see a sleek black car glide to a stop outside the garage, its lights momentarily flooding the cold, cluttered space with a ghostly brightness. It wasn't a family car. It wasn't a rideshare. It was long, low, and unmistakably a limousine. Aaliyah blinked. Corey moved closer to the dusty window and squinted. "Mom!" Lynn grabbed her mother's hand. The engine cut off. The three of them stood frozen in that moment, unaware that their world was about to pivot, that everything they had just endured was, in some strange way, about to become the beginning of something entirely different. Aaliyah didn't know yet who was in that car, but she knew one thing, as sure as the cold in her fingers and the silence in her chest: whoever had come had not parked in front of Belinda's grand double doors. They had come to the garage. For a moment, Aaliyah didn't move. Her hand was still resting on the garage door handle, her mind trying to catch up to what her eyes had just seen. A limousine. A real one. The kind reserved for celebrities and weddings, not suburban Thanksgiving dinners, and certainly not garages. Its black body gleamed under the dim driveway lights like it didn't belong in this neighborhood, like it had taken a wrong turn from somewhere far more important. Corey's breath had fogged the glass as he leaned against the garage window, trying to see more. "It's still there," he whispered, as if speaking louder might break the spell. Lynn squeezed Aaliyah's hand, her eyes wide and searching. "Why would a limo come here?" she asked. Aaliyah had no answer. The last thing she expected tonight, after being humiliated and fed scraps and seated in a space not meant for people, was for anything extraordinary to arrive. And yet, here it was, idling just beyond the garage door as if it belonged to them. She stepped closer to the window, brushing past boxes and an old push mower, and looked out. The car had stopped directly in front of the garage. Not the main entrance, not the wide, sweeping front steps where guests had arrived earlier with pies and bottles of wine and designer coats. This car had chosen the back. Aaliyah's pulse quickened. The driver's door opened. A tall man in a pressed black suit and hat stepped out. His movements were fluid and precise, not hurried. He walked to the rear passenger side and opened the door with deliberate grace. From within, a figure emerged, graceful, upright, and dressed in a navy blue wool coat that fell to her calves. The woman moved slowly, but not with age, rather with purpose, as if she had timed her arrival down to the second. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back into a twist, and her heels clicked once on the concrete before she came to a full stop in front of the garage. Aaliyah opened the side door halfway and stepped into the chill. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice smooth, resonant, and calmly assured. "I'm looking for the owner of this house." Aaliyah's lips parted, but she hesitated. "That would be my sister. She lives here, inside." The woman tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady and unfazed by the boxes, the dust, the draft slipping through the cracks in the wall. "And you are?" she asked gently. Aaliyah Rivers." There was a pause, then a soft smile bloomed across the woman's face. "Yes, you're exactly who I came to see." Behind her, Corey had risen from his chair. Lynn clung to her mother's side, uncertain but curious. The three of them formed a fragile triangle in the doorway, the kind born of habit and shared disappointment, the kind that usually braced for rejection. But this woman's tone carried none of that. Instead, it held something unfamiliar: recognition. "I'm Margot Ellington," she said, "founder of Women Forward. We run outreach and mentorship programs across the state, especially for women navigating hardship and transition. You volunteered with one of our shelters about 5 years ago, correct?" Aaliyah blinked. "Yes, I was going through a rough time. After I left my husband, I worked nights, stayed on a friend's couch, and during the day I'd help where I could. Cleaning, folding donations. Sometimes I wrote blog posts for the shelter's site." Margot's smile deepened. "I read them, all of them. They were raw, honest, beautiful. You wrote with a voice that cut through the noise. You wrote pain without pity, struggle without shame, and most importantly, you wrote with truth." Aaliyah felt heat rising in her face. Not embarrassment, something closer to disbelief. That chapter of her life had been buried in exhaustion. She had never imagined it had been read, let alone remembered. "I've been following your writing ever since," Margot continued. "Your words have stayed with me. And this year, when we began planning our national summit, we knew we wanted something different. Not just success stories and tailored suits. We wanted someone who understood what it means to rise from the floor. We wanted you." Aaliyah's heart pounded. "You want me to speak?" Margot nodded. "As our keynote speaker, we'll cover all travel, accommodations, childcare if needed. And we're offering a publishing contract. Your story deserves a wider audience. Your voice matters, Aaliyah." For a long moment, Aaliyah couldn't breathe. Behind her, Corey's voice was soft but clear. "Wait, she wants you to speak? Like, on a stage?" Lynn's eyes widened. "Because of your writing?" Margot looked at both children and said with a warmth that made Aaliyah's throat tighten, "Because your mom is extraordinary." Aaliyah's fingers curled slightly around the edge of the doorframe. She turned her head toward the house instinctively. Through the narrow garage window, she could see shadows shifting behind the curtains. The living room was no longer filled with laughter. There was stillness now, the kind that comes when something unthinkable interrupts the script. They were watching. She could imagine it. Belinda's hand frozen halfway to her wine glass, Brad's smug posture wilted into confusion. Their mother's eyes narrowed as she strained to understand who this woman was, and why she wasn't walking up the front steps. Why she was here, in the garage, speaking to Aaliyah as if she mattered. She looked back at Margot. "Are you sure you have the right person?" she asked, the old voice in her head still whispering doubt, still wondering if this was a cruel misunderstanding. "I'm absolutely sure," Margot said. "I've waited months to say this to you in person. We want you." And in that moment, something in Aaliyah lifted. Not like a balloon, but like stone, like armor. Something she had carried for years without realizing it was never hers to bear. The shame of not being wanted, the weight of being tolerated, the constant shrinking. It fell away. She stepped outside fully, letting the cold air wash over her. "I'd be honored," she said. Margot extended her hand, not dramatically, but simply, with quiet certainty. Aaliyah took it. Corey gathered the food containers carefully, cradling them like they mattered. Lynn slipped her hand back into her mother's, her face radiant with awe. Together, they followed Margot toward the car. The limousine's interior was warm, softly lit, and lined with leather seats that seemed impossibly comfortable. Aaliyah settled in, holding Lynn on one side, Corey on the other. Margot sat across from them and spoke to the driver through a lowered window. "Dinner downtown, please. Then we'll discuss the summit and the publishing agreement." As the car pulled away, Aaliyah turned her head one last time. Through the parted curtains of the living room, she caught a final glimpse of Belinda's face. Pale, mouth slightly open, eyes wide with disbelief. Her mother sat beside her, stone-faced, the glass in her hand trembling. They looked stunned. Not angry, not outraged, just stunned. As if the story had taken a turn they hadn't written. As if the person they had tried to discard had been picked up by the world and lifted into the light. The garage faded behind them. For the first time in years, Aaliyah felt like she wasn't just surviving. She was seen, not for what she lacked, not for where she had come from, but for who she had always been. The city lights unfolded like a constellation as the limousine wove its way from the polished driveways of the suburbs to the glowing pulse of downtown. Aaliyah sat in stillness, one hand resting on Lynn's small shoulder, the other on Corey's arm. The warmth inside the car was deep and enveloping, as though the universe itself had wrapped them in something long denied but deeply deserved. Outside, skyscrapers glimmered, storefronts gleamed, and passing headlights blurred into long, golden streaks across the window glass. She could hardly speak. It wasn't that she had no words. There were too many. They tangled inside her, too heavy to lift, too full of disbelief to spill easily. The space between her ribs felt wide and trembling. Everything had changed in less than 15 minutes, and yet the air in the car was calm, like it had always been waiting for this moment to arrive. Margot sat across from them, composed and warm, her elegant navy coat folded neatly over her lap. She spoke only after giving them time to breathe, to look around, to adjust to the foreign texture of dignity. "We have a dinner reservation at the Marlowe," she said. "It's quiet, private. They have a table prepared for us. I thought it might be a good place to begin discussing what's next." Aaliyah nodded, her voice still caught somewhere between her chest and throat. That sounds perfect." Lynn was gazing out the window with the wide-eyed awe only a child can manage. Her hands pressed to the glass as they passed a grand hotel lit by a canopy of golden bulbs. Corey sat with his arms folded but not in resistance. For the first time in hours, he wasn't defensive, only stunned. His posture had softened. His jaw no longer clenched. Aaliyah watched him silently and saw something flicker across his face, something she hadn't seen in a long time. Pride. It was nearly surreal. Just an hour ago, they were in a garage, surrounded by storage bins and cold metal chairs, eating from plastic plates and swallowing down shame. And now, this. The same world, the same night, but it felt like someone had flipped the script of their story and handed them the next chapter. As the limo slowed before a discreet entrance flanked by tall hedges and soft uplighting, a man in a black suit stepped forward to open the door. Margot exited first, then turned and offered her hand to Aaliyah. Lynn followed, clinging gently to her mother's skirt, and Corey emerged last, his eyes scanning everything with cautious wonder. The restaurant was quiet elegance, dim lighting, soft jazz drifting from hidden speakers, and the kind of staff who moved like ghosts, present without ever intruding. A table awaited them near the window, draped in crisp white linen, the silverware polished to a glow. Aaliyah hesitated as they approached, but Margot gave her a gentle nod, encouraging her forward. Once seated, a server brought warm bread wrapped in a cloth napkin, poured water into glasses like crystal, and disappeared. No one stared at them, no one whispered. There was only space and warmth and dignity. Aaliyah looked across the table at Margot, the disbelief finally giving way to curiosity. "Why me?" she asked, her voice softer now, not from fear but from genuine wonder. There must be so many women with louder voices, better credentials. I didn't even know anyone was reading what I wrote. Margot smiled and leaned forward slightly. That's exactly why. We've had years of polished voices, experts, professionals, but what we're missing in this world right now is truth. You didn't write to impress, you wrote to survive. And in doing that, you gave language to women who had none. You made someone like me, someone far removed from where you stood, feel something. That's rare. That's necessary. Aaliyah stared down at her folded hands in her lap, her knuckles pale with memory. She thought about the nights she had typed on her cracked phone screen while her children slept on a borrowed mattress, the times she had doubted every word, thinking no one would ever care. And yet, here she was, in a restaurant that didn't serve leftovers, speaking to a woman who had walked straight past chandeliers and turkey platters and come to a cold garage door. She glanced over at Corey, who was now trying a piece of artisan bread with quiet interest, and Lynn, who beamed when the waiter placed a small dish of sugared butter before her. "When I wrote those posts," Aaliyah said, "I didn't think anyone would read them. I wrote them because I had no one to talk to. No one wanted to hear about eviction notices or food stamps or my husband's betrayal. No one wanted to hear about how it felt to be invisible. So I put it all into words and hoped that maybe, just maybe, someone out there might feel a little less alone." Margot nodded. "And that's why your voice matters. We're building something new. A platform that doesn't just speak down from a stage, but rises from the floor, from garages and shelters and kitchens at midnight. We want you to open the summit, and we want to publish your story." The words settled like feathers, soft but weighty. Aaliyah felt something inside her unlock. Not just hope, agency, not just gratitude, ownership. She said yes. They talked for hours. Margot asked thoughtful questions and took notes on a small leather-bound pad, jotting down moments Aaliyah had almost forgotten. The first time she cried while folding laundry after her ex left. The birthday when she couldn't afford candles. The moment she decided not to cry in front of the kids ever again. Every story mattered. Every scar was a map. Every survival, a credential. When dessert came, Lynn declared it fancier than TV food, and Corey, after much hesitation, tried creme brulee for the first time and didn't hate it. They laughed together, not because anything was particularly funny, but because the laughter had been bottled up for too long and now had permission to breathe. When the check arrived, Margot waved it away with a simple gesture. "You've already paid enough," she said. The ride home was quieter, not from awkwardness, but from peace. A silence that didn't ache. A silence that didn't mean, "Don't speak," but "You're safe." Lynn leaned against Aaliyah and whispered, "Is this what it's like to be famous?" Aaliyah chuckled. "No, baby. This is what it's like to be respected." As the limousine pulled into the quiet block where they lived, Aaliyah saw their apartment from a new perspective. It hadn't changed, but she had. The chipped paint, the uneven pavement, the flickering hallway light, all still there. But they no longer defined her. She climbed the stairs with the children in tow, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. Home. Later that night, after brushing teeth and sharing whispered bedtime stories, she tucked Lynn into bed. The girl clutched her favorite stuffed rabbit and blinked sleepily up at her mother. "I'm glad they put us in the garage," she said. Aliyah stilled. "You are?" Lynn nodded. "Yeah, 'cause if they didn't, the limo wouldn't have found us." Aliyah couldn't respond. Her throat was too tight. She kissed Lynn's forehead and whispered, "You're smart." "I get it from my mom," the girl replied, then rolled over and drifted off. Aliyah sat on the edge of the bed for a long while after that, listening to the soft breath of her daughter, the steady hum of the heater, the quiet promise of a world just beginning to unfold. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Her mind played the evening on loop, but not in panic, in awe. It felt like the end of something and the start of something bigger. She wasn't sure yet what shape it would take or how long it would last, but she knew without question that they hadn't broken her in that garage. They had revealed her. And now the world had seen. Winter arrived slowly that year, not with snow or ice, but with the subtle transformation of air. The days became crisper, the trees stood bare like quiet sentinels, and the sky seemed to darken just a little earlier each afternoon. Aliyah moved through it all like someone learning a new language, careful, observant, carrying a tremble of disbelief under every breath. Even after weeks had passed, the sound of the limousine's engine still echoed in her memory like a note struck on a piano that never quite faded. Things changed quickly after that night. The very next morning, her inbox was filled with messages from Margot's team. Warm, professional, enthusiastic emails that outlined schedules, travel logistics, and preliminary outlines for the summit. They spoke of keynote materials, stage preparation, and the upcoming publishing contract with the same calm certainty they might use to describe a catered lunch or an upcoming conference call. But for Aliyah, every line felt like a miracle written in plain text. Her phone rang with unfamiliar area codes. Editors, event planners, journalists who had seen the summit announcement. The foundation had made it official. Aliyah Rivers would be opening the National Women Forward Summit in Chicago that spring. Her name appeared in newsletters and press releases, attached not as a footnote, not as Belinda's sister, but standing alone. Bold, centered. At first, she thought it might all be temporary, that the interest would burn bright and then vanish, as so many things did in her life. But it didn't. The light stayed. Margot's team followed through on every promise. Aliyah was assigned a writing coach, someone to help her shape the blog posts she had written in exhaustion and grief into a manuscript. They sent equipment, an ergonomic chair, a new laptop, a quiet printer that hummed like approval. A publisher sent her a contract with numbers that made her sit down on the edge of her bed and reread it 6 times, afraid the decimal might disappear if she blinked too hard. The first check that came in didn't buy her a new car or a bigger place, but it covered rent for 5 months in advance, and she framed the receipt. Not because of the amount, but because it was the first time in her life she had been paid for her voice. And then something even more subtle happened. She changed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the small, powerful ways that build a life. She stopped apologizing when she spoke. She stopped shrinking herself in rooms that were too loud. She stopped saying yes out of fear of seeming ungrateful. The day she walked into the small bookstore downtown to sign a few pre-release copies of her upcoming memoir, she did so in the same coat she had worn on Thanksgiving, the one she had almost left at home because she thought it looked tired. She wore it proudly, because the fabric didn't matter. Her story did. Corey began writing too. Quietly at first, notes and poems tucked between textbooks, thoughts scribbled into a dollar store notebook he refused to show anyone. Then, one evening, while sitting at the kitchen table with his headphones on, he slid it toward her without a word. She opened it, heart pounding, and read a poem titled, "Chairs Don't Make the Table." The lines were short, fierce, and unsparing. He didn't mention the garage, but she saw it in every sentence. Saw the shame turned into shape. Saw the silence turned into sound. Lynn stayed Lynn, curious, compassionate, full of bright-eyed wonder. But she became more than a child seeking approval. She became a girl who watched her mother stand up and decided she could too. She started a kindness journal where she documented every moment someone had made her feel seen. And one night, Aaliyah found a sticky note on the mirror that read, "You're my favorite writer, even more than Mo Willems." The three of them moved through the world differently now. Not richer, not more important, just more rooted. And that, perhaps, was the greatest shift of all. Thanksgiving came again faster than she expected. The air turned sharp, the sky took on its annual silver hue, and suddenly it was time to think about turkeys and pies and the fragile, powerful ritual of gathering. Margot's assistant had called a week before, offering a reservation at a luxury retreat. "We'd be honored to host your family for the holiday," she had said. Aaliyah had thanked her but declined. This year, she was hosting. Their apartment was still small, the radiator still hissed like an old kettle, and the kitchen could barely fit 3 people at once without bumping elbows. But it was warm, lived in, lined with books and drawings and the smell of cinnamon. They invited friends, mothers from the shelter Aaliyah once volunteered at, a former neighbor who had once lent her flour, a teacher who had encouraged Corey when he was falling behind, a woman who used to clean offices with her and now owned a mobile cleaning business of her own. They brought casseroles and mismatched dishes, pies that leaned sideways in their boxes, bags of rolls with the tops wrinkled from the grocery store shelf. Nobody wore pearls or cashmere. Nobody asked if they were in the right place. Everyone came in laughing. There weren't enough chairs, but no one cared. People sat on floor cushions, on pillows, on blankets folded over crates. There were seconds, thirds, and the kind of conversation that makes you forget how tired you are. Lynn passed out napkins like a hostess on a mission. Corey manned the music. Aaliyah moved through the space with sleeves rolled up, cheeks flushed, heart full. No one mentioned Belinda. No one asked if they were spending the holiday with family, and she didn't offer an explanation. Because this was family. That morning, Aaliyah had received a text from her mother. Just 2 lines. "Hope you're well. Miss you sometimes." She stared at it for a long time. Then she typed back, "We're doing fine. Hope you are too." No anger, no resentment, just peace. Because that's what healing felt like now, not like a triumphant anthem, but like a quiet room where you could finally rest. As night fell and the last guest drifted out the door with a paper plate of leftovers, Aaliyah stood in the middle of her living room and took it all in. She hadn't needed a chandelier to feel seen. She hadn't needed a linen-draped table to feel like a host. She had needed this. The hum of connection, the echo of laughter, the quiet joy of knowing that she had not just survived the past year, she had transformed it. Later, Lynn climbed into her lap on the couch and rested her head on her mother's chest. "Do you think we'll ever go back?" she asked. "Where?" Aaliyah asked, brushing her daughter's hair back gently. "To that big house. To Aunt Belinda's." Aaliyah paused. "Do you want to?" Lynn thought for a moment, then shook her head. "No, I just wondered." Aaliyah kissed the top of her head. "We don't need to go back to a place where we weren't welcome. We've built something better." Lynn smiled sleepily. "Yeah, I like our table, even if it's the floor." "It's not the floor," Aaliyah said. "It's wherever we are together." She looked around at the apartment, its chipped paint, its crooked shelves, its flickering kitchen light, and saw none of the things that used to make her feel small. She saw a home built not from wealth, but from intention, from courage, from the kind of love that doesn't care about chairs or china. This was her new chapter, not perfect, not glossy, but hers. The morning of the summit dawned cold and clear, the kind of spring day that carried a quiet promise in the air. Aaliyah stood at the window of her hotel room, high above the city, looking down at the tiny figures bustling on the sidewalks below. The skyline of Chicago stretched wide before her, glass and steel catching the sunlight like blades turned sideways. Behind her, a navy blue dress hung neatly on the back of the chair, pressed and waiting. Her name was listed on the event's program in bold letters, "Aaliyah Rivers, Keynote Speaker," printed just beneath the name of the foundation, and above a brief phrase that had become something of a mantra: "More than scraps." She touched the window gently with her fingers, not for warmth, but to make sure she was really here. Just a year ago, she had stood in a garage with her children, fighting back tears while holding a flimsy paper plate. Now, she would be standing on a stage in front of hundreds of women, CEOs, professors, activists, single mothers, students, all gathered to hear her speak. The transformation felt impossible and inevitable at once. The foundation had spared no detail. A stylist had come to the hotel early that morning, brushing out Aaliyah's hair with gentle hands, shaping curls that framed her face like a crown. The makeup artist, a woman named Denise, had listened to Aaliyah's story with tears in her eyes and said, "You don't need much. You already walk like someone worth listening to." It was the kind of compliment Aaliyah would have once deflected, unsure of her place in such spaces, but today she just smiled and said, "Thank you." In the other room, Corey and Lynn were getting ready with the help of Margot's assistant. Corey wore a navy suit that made him look older than 12, the sleeves tailored just enough to let him grow. Lynn, radiant in a soft gold dress, had insisted on wearing sneakers underneath. "In case I need to run," she said, winking. Aaliyah had laughed then, a sound that came easier these days, fuller, rounder. When the black car arrived to take them to the venue, Aaliyah stepped inside with steady hands and a heart that, while still full of nerves, no longer trembled with fear. The auditorium was already buzzing when they arrived. Muffled conversation, clinking coffee cups, the occasional staccato of heels against tile. Posters with her face and the summit's theme lined the hallway walls, stories that change us. Aaliyah's image was not airbrushed or lit to perfection. It was real. Her eyes calm, her mouth poised to speak. Margot met her at the entrance to the green room. She was wearing her signature navy coat again, her presence just as grounded and commanding as that first night. "You ready?" she asked. "I think so," Aaliyah answered. Margot smiled. "You don't need to be perfect, you just need to be you." That was enough. Backstage, she stood in the wings and waited for her cue, her speech folded in her hand, though she barely needed to glance at it anymore. She had lived these words. They were inked into her bones. When the host introduced her, applause echoed through the room. Elia stepped into the light, each footfall quiet but confident. The crowd quieted. Hundreds of eyes watched her take her place at the podium. She adjusted the microphone and looked out over the sea of women, searching briefly for her children. They sat in the second row, side by side. Lynn waved. Corey gave a small nod, chin lifted, proud, and Aaliyah began. She didn't open with grandeur. She opened with truth. She told them about the garage, not for shock value, not to draw pity, but because it was where the illusion shattered and the revelation began. She spoke of paper plates, of silent dinners, of the moment her daughter asked if they had done something wrong. She described the cold, not just the physical cold of concrete floors and drafty doors, but the emotional cold of being excluded by blood. The kind of rejection that settles into your skin and makes a home there. She told them about the limousine, how it didn't pull up to the front door, but came for her where she was, in a place meant to shame her, and how that changed everything. How Margot had looked at her, not with charity, but with respect, and how, for the first time, she had begun to look at herself that way too. She spoke of survival, of waking up in the middle of the night and writing blog posts in the dark, of folding laundry with tears on her cheeks and pretending not to notice the missed calls from bill collectors, of raising children on hope and grit, of learning to listen to her own voice even when no one else did. And then she spoke of the moment she stopped asking for a seat at someone else's table. I spent so many years, she said, her voice steady now, believing that if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, smiled wide enough, I would be invited in. That eventually they'd say, "You belong here." But that invitation never came. And in that garage, I realized maybe it wasn't supposed to. Because some of us aren't meant to wait for a table. We're meant to build our own. The silence that followed her words was electric. And then it broke. Applause rising like a wave, long and loud and full of something deeper than admiration. Recognition. Elia stepped back from the microphone, her breath shaken now, not from nerves, but from release. She spotted Margot standing in the wings, her eyes shining. Corey clapped with both hands, his smile wide. Lynn had tears on her cheeks and didn't bother to wipe them. After the speech, she stood for hours in the reception hall, accepting hugs, handshakes, and stories from strangers. Women who had read her blog posts in hospital rooms. Women who had grown up in foster care. Women who had been told they were too loud, too dark, too much. They didn't thank her for being polished. They thanked her for being real. When she finally returned to the hotel that evening, her heels were in her hand, and her hair had come loose from the careful pins. But she felt more herself than ever. In the weeks that followed, the book came out. More than scraps hit shelves and websites and book clubs. It didn't sell millions, but it found its readers. And those who found it didn't just read it. They carried it, quoted it, passed it along like a quiet revolution in paperback form. She cried the first time she held the finished copy. Not because of the cover, though it was beautiful. Not because of the money, though it helped. But because for the first time her name, just hers, stood alone on the spine. No one else's approval stamped above it. No shadowed surname following behind. Just Aaliyah Rivers. And that was enough. She framed the first handwritten letter she received from a reader. It came from a woman in Ohio who wrote, "I thought I was the only one in the garage. Thank you for turning on the light." Time passed and the world kept spinning. Not everything was easy. Bills still came. The car still coughed when it was cold, But there was peace in the struggle now. Pride, even. Not the kind that needs to be seen, but the kind that lets you sleep through the night. Corey's journal became a binder, then a Google Doc. He never said much about it, but sometimes Aaliyah would hear the soft click of keys long after bedtime. Lynn wanted to start a podcast. For kids, she said, to talk about how we feel. Since adults forget to ask. On the next Thanksgiving, she cooked for 15 people. Friends, neighbors, 2 of her old teachers, a girl from the shelter with her newborn. They crammed into the apartment, eating from real plates and paper ones, laughing over spilled gravy, swapping stories as candles flickered in mismatched holders. No one asked what happened the year before, but as she passed a tray of rolls to Corey, he paused and looked at her with a quiet smile. He said, "This is a pretty good table." And she smiled back. The best kind, she said, because she knew now. You can waste years trying to earn the love of people who never learned how to give it. Or you can give that love to yourself and to those who need it, and watch how it multiplies. Sometimes being sent to the garage isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's where the real one begins. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more. Don't forget to check out the other videos on the channel. You won't want to miss what's coming next. And if someone you know needs to hear this, share it with them today.